This week on Perspective, Feminism and Foreign Policy. For most of modern history, feminism and foreign policy seemed a contradiction in terms. And though it may be 2017, feminism itself is a controversial idea in much of the world. That's changing, slowly. There is clear evidence now that societies that recognize gender equality are more peaceful and prosperous. Earlier this year, the Canadian government announced its Feminist International Assistance Policy, a move that so far amounts to redirecting existing aid money. In 5 years, the government promises 80% of Canada's aid money will target gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. International aid is, of course, only one aspect of a foreign policy. This week in Ottawa, a panel discussion on foreign policy highlighted women's voices. For the first time, 4 of the most high-profile ambassadors to Canada are women from the US, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom.
I have made a conscious decision that I will not take up a job unless I am the first woman to do it as an ambassador. Because I think there are so many jobs that have not been done by women. Why should I do one that a woman has done before?
On the program this week, perspectives on feminism and foreign policy, beginning with a longtime advocate for equality, Kim Campbell, Canada's only female Prime Minister. Since the days of your direct political involvement in Ottawa and parliamentary politics, how would you describe the way that your own politics have evolved?
Well, I think I'm probably sort of roughly where I was. I've always been a centrist. Although I look with amazement at sort of everybody else seems to have moved right. I may always joke that in Canada I'm a progressive conservative and in the US I'm a commie, because I just feel, I mean, it's just sort of extraordinary views. And I think I'm sort of where I always was, but, you know, maybe a bit more passionate about some things, a bit more worried about the future of democracy. Encouraged that women are doing well, I think better, and that there's lots more research and kind of solid evidence about the value of putting women in leadership positions, whether it's in business or government, whatever, that gives them some support. But yeah, I think I care about a lot of the same things.
You said not that long ago that you don't have a party to call home. Is that just because the evolution of those political parties doesn't fit you anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I was a progressive conservative, and our party was a big tent party. You know, I'm a pro-choice, pro-gay rights, socially liberal person from Vancouver Centre. And some of the people that I cared most about were Bible Belters from the Fraser Valley or other, people who had different views from me. But because we were in the same party, in the same caucus, we really tried to respect each other and work together and find common ground. And to me, that's the essence of democracy, is it's easy to agree with people who think like you. Can you find common ground with people who don't necessarily share your views, and where there are some things you can agree to do and things you agree to disagree? Because a lot of the issues that come up, some things are issues that are your party platform and people come together because they share that same center of gravity. Other things come up, something like the Morgentaler decision, for example, which threw the abortion legislation up in the air. And, those issues are not confined, or positions are not confined to one party. In fact, all parties are divided on these issues. So the real question is, can you create common ground? Can you find a kind of a family sense? And I felt our party did that, and I was very comfortable in it.
But since then, and I think this is a common concern, it's not just about, as you've expressed, sort of the nature of democracy and what's happened, but it's also the nature of the debate, the civil conversation that you're supposed to have to be able to find that common ground. That seems to have disappeared in some sense.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not, I was out of Canada for a long time. So I've watched this happen mostly in the United States, where I think it's just appalling, the polarization. And it was interesting, about 10 or 15 years ago, RAND did a study in the US showing how that people were actually living in more polarized environments. People were moving to places where people agreed with them more, and which is really worrisome. And Bob Putnam's study on social capital, where he said, his book Bowling Alone, more people than ever are bowling, but they're not bowling in leagues. They're bowling, with their spouse, or they're not bowling in circumstances that create the opportunity to talk about what's going on in the community. So there are a lot of ways in which those kinds of interactions are now confined to people who already think alike. And if you see the graphs of the American Congress, you know, the blue and the red, and you know, they used to be intertwined.
There used to be some purple.
Yeah, and overlap, and now it's very, very polarized, and that worries me. I don't know that that's the same thing in Canada. I think for one thing, we have different media rules, which mean that our public media have to present different views on things. When, you know, I've had people disagree with me on this, but when the American Federal Communications Commission changed the free and fair rules, I think in the late 70s, so that media outlets could be more ideologically homogeneous, I think that helped to start the echo chamber of, you know, people listening to people who agreed with them. And I think, you know, growing up, what it was like to, you know, you turned on the news, you know, and there were shows, you know, like Point Counterpoint, I think, that was done on the PBS stations, and, you know, other things where you brought people together, and it was a kind of a natural debate and discussion, and you listened to people from different parties, and they'd score points, and maybe you'd cheer for your guy. But you heard the other points of view, and they were expressed in a respectful way. And there's much less of it, and certainly in the United States, which desperately needs it.
Yeah. When you say more broadly that you think the world is in peril, what are you driving at? Is that part of it?
Yeah. Well, that's part of what's making it so difficult, and the role of social media, and what we've seen, you know, in the American election, and now the British are concerned about the role of Russian hackers and bots in Brexit. You know, when the Cold War ended and Francis Fukuyama wrote his book, The End of History, sort of, you know, the idea that liberal democracy had kind of won the battle in the Cold War. It was premature. I mean, it was a very exciting time, and we all wanted Russia, for example, to become democratic. And so when Putin says that people, you know, didn't want Russia to succeed, that's not true at all. I think people thought, oh, how great, this talented, gifted people. You know, what will they do, you know, if they have democracy, if they have greater freedom with all the skill and intelligence that they have. And, but the problem is that you don't ever do away with greed and selfishness. You create kleptocrats, you know, like Putin. You know, I think he was, well, from early on when he was working for the mayor of St. Petersburg, he was already, you know, accumulating his fortune and playing these games. But, you know, once you're a kleptocrat and you've stolen stuff, you don't want democracies on your border. You certainly don't want democratic activists in your own society. So you find ways of marginalizing them, either just seriously oppressing them, scaring them, you know, portraying them as being enemies of your country. And then on your margins, you certainly don't want them. And if you can undermine the stability and credibility of other democracies to sort of show them as a bad example and to make them dysfunctional, then you're okay. Because, you know, there's no room for the rule of law, you know, when 75% now of the economy of Russia is in the hands of the state, and the state is Vladimir Putin.
When you look at the divisiveness in the US and in Britain and even in parts of Europe, you look at the situation with Russia and even North Korea, China, many observers have said there's an opportunity for a country like Canada here. Do you think that's so? And if so, is Canada taking that opportunity? Well,
you know, Canadians, we're funny. We're proud of our country, but we're also a little frightened about hubris. And, you know, we're not a huge country. We're not a huge military power or whatever. But there are kind of moments in history where you get a chance to have the attention. You know, I think our Prime Minister is a very, you know, charismatic, attractive person who's drawn attention around the world. And this gives an opportunity for us to articulate values because people are listening. I think there is a great concern in much of the world about the values of liberal democracy. I'm really encouraged by Emmanuel Macron and Angela Merkel, their desire to really support Europe. I think the European Union's a miracle. And, you know, it's when you think about the history of that part of the world, I mean, what they have created is outstanding. Is it perfect? No. But is it the best thing they've ever done? Probably yes. And can it get better? Of course. So I think what Canada, for many people, Canada reflects this notion of, you know, an effective, a functioning democracy. And I think we really are. There are certain things that we do that have made it possible for us to have a very good educational system. I think we have the highest percentage of people with post-secondary education anywhere in the world. And, you know, we have some egalitarian aspects. We're a free market economy, but we have redistribution and egalitarian things because we understand that people need to be able to participate. And I think those are values that speak well around the world, and I think people look to Canada. Now, we're also incredibly lucky. We have this huge country and natural resources and all this kind of stuff. But I think without being arrogant or having hubris, I would say that it is important for Canada to engage, because I think now there really is another almost Cold War happening between the forces of resurgent authoritarianism and the values of democracy that really needs to be fought as much as we can. So if Canada can play a role and use our example to encourage others, then I think we need to do that we need to be engaged and we need to stand for those things.
So one of the pillars, if I can put it that way, of the Trudeau government's foreign policy is this idea of a feminist foreign policy. What does that look like to you?
Well, it's interesting. I'm not sure that I would when I say a feminist foreign policy, in that way I would suggest it means a foreign policy that is aware of the gender dimension of many of the things that we do globally. If we go back to the time, for example, when Hillary Clinton was First Lady of the United States, she created an organization called Vital Voices. And then when she was Secretary of State, she picked up this idea of making the advancement of women a key part of American foreign policy. So building on what she'd done with Vital Voices, she worked with countries around the world to empower women entrepreneurs and working with women leaders, et cetera. And I think that's part of it, is understanding that, Pew Research has shown that the status of women is one of the most important indicators of the degree of modernity in a country, social, economic, and political advancement. And we're the kind of canary in the mine. I think also it's important, we look at the things like women in peace and security and the Security Council resolutions 1325 and after. And again, that's actually a reflection of the growing understanding that when women are not engaged in post-conflict resolutions, they fail. I was on the crisis group board for a number of years, and Don Steinberg, who was the vice president, persuaded the crisis group to include gender as one of its thematic interests, because in his own experience as an assistant secretary of state in the Clinton administration, he, in his view, had completely missed the boat in negotiating a peace agreement in Africa. And I can't remember if it was Angola or Sierra Leone, but where they didn't have women there. And they made this agreement. And of course, it fell apart because there were no women sitting around the table. And he said 40 men are sitting around the table. The men are giving other men amnesty for the crimes that they committed against women. But there's no understanding of the dimensions that have to be dealt with because of what women will do after the conflict, how to reintegrate women who were in the conflict. So it's efficacy. It's not just being nice, truth, beauty, and justice.
Well, I was going to say, you've often been the only woman at the table in those kinds of circumstances. So what is it that they bring that brings about a better success rate in terms of? Well,
the reality of life as women live it is a key part of any society, and in some ways it's different from that of men. So if you are looking to reconstruct a society and you're not asking yourself, what do we need women to do? What role are women going to play? How were women affected by the conflict? What do we need to, how do we need to engage them to rebuild after the conflict? You're walking on one leg. You're forgetting that. And I did a program with the Club of Madrid on women in peace and security in the Horn of Africa. And I remember Mary Robinson and I went to launch the first mission of this in Addis Ababa. And one of the women was from Uganda. And she said, I was talking to our foreign minister, and I said, I'm off to do this program on women in peace and security. He said, but what do women have to do with peace and security? And she said, so I sat down and I explained it to him, the issues that they need to deal with. And then he said, oh, I get it. It's like, but if you've only ever seen, if you think peace and security is men sitting around a table negotiating, you won't notice that somebody's missing. You won't notice that you're not talking about certain things. And then it all goes to hell in a handbasket. You say, well, how did that happen?
Right. It goes beyond conflict resolution, though, obviously. When you say you're passionate about some issues now more than perhaps in the past, what would those be? Well,
I think in terms of women's leadership, I think that getting women into positions in decision-making that affect the way we live is very important. And another aspect of what might be a feminist foreign policy would be advocating for laws and norms that protect women. You know, I go back to the days when I did my sexual assault law, and I remember talking to Louise Arbour when she was chief war crimes prosecutor at The Hague, and I said, you know, how amazing this was that they had just declared that systemic rape would be a war crime. And she said, yes, but we can't do that without the progress that people make in domestic legislation. So as countries get more progressive, that creates a norm that we can then bring into the international arena. So, you know, a feminist foreign policy or a gender-sensitive foreign policy would look at those areas where international norms could support the opportunity of women to participate and where you would require certain kinds of protections as sort of conditions of certain kinds of relations.
So where does the Quebec niqab bill fit into that scenario?
Well, it seems to me to be kind of a ham-fisted way of dealing with something. You know, it's funny, I'm torn in this sense that I dislike forms of clothing whose purpose it is to hold women accountable for men's sexuality. I think there are some women who are, you know, weren't born into cultures doing this, who, you know, take this on and say, well, I'm going to do it as a source of, you know, making a point. But it makes me very sad because we know anthropologically that, you know, looking at people's faces is how you build empathy. And therefore women whose faces are never shown are not creating empathy from people. So if I could, you know, get rid of niqabs, I would. On the other hand, and I had some interesting discussions with people when this was an issue during the last election, that if a woman comes and this is required of her and her family, outlawing it is not going to help her. She's not going to be allowed to go out. The way to undermine the cultural basis of this, what we would consider discriminatory, you know, a type of clothing. Although, you know, people are doing cartoons and showing, you know, in Quebec people are, you know, wrapped up with their hats and their scarves. So it's not that people always walk around with their faces showing. But if you think it's discriminatory, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater by putting these women in a situation where they never will go out. They never will be able to do their errands, that they will be kept in their homes, because that kind of defeats the purpose. So it's not that I don't understand the resistance that people who grow up in our society have towards any kind of tradition that seems to be effacing women, which is literally what it does. But, you know, the question is, what is the answer? Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that this, I mean, I think it probably serves their electoral purposes in Quebec, but whether it serves the purpose of eventually trying to get rid of these garments, I don't know. But it is also interesting. I know a lot of women, I mean, I do a lot of work in the Muslim world, women who are fighting to get rid of these requirements, to get rid of restrictive clothing.
Yes. Keep their faith, but not the clothing.
Yeah.
Before I let you go, I wanted to know what it's like to be the first Prime Minister of SAS, according to BuzzFeed.
Oh, SAS. Oh, golly.
You know, they told you that you were, what did they make a list? 16 times Kim Campbell was a Canadian treasure on Twitter. But my favorite one was your comment about Boris Johnson and Brexit. And you said he's a pusillanimous vandal of historic proportions, a despicable destroyer of the creations of his betters. In short, a frabjous ass. I had to go and look up frabjous. What is it? I mean, dare I say, you and Donald Trump may have something in common. You like Twitter, obviously. What is it about that?
Well, Twitter is, you know, and I keep saying that I overtweet, and I run into people who say, oh, I love your Twitter feed. And I say, I think I overtweet. It's a sign of anxiety. And they say, oh, no, keep doing it. I do think I'm wasting a lot of time with it, and I need to do it less. But, and I don't tweet about Canadian politics because, you know, I can't say anything I want to say in 140 characters anyway. But it is a sign of my anxiety. And, you know, what I said about Boris Johnson, I stand by. I mean, I look, you know, here is somebody who covered the EU from Brussels for a British newspaper and deliberately said false things about it and lied about it and in a very destructive way, but thought it was funny. When people say, well, that's not true, Boris. I know, but it gets a laugh. People like it. Really? Is that what we're about here? You know, who chose the Leave side in the referendum because he thought it would lose. And therefore, after the referendum, he would be able to rally the Leave side Tories and become leader of the party. Really? Is that what we do? And when I say, you know, a destroyer, you know, a vandal destroying the creations of his betters, the European Union is something really extraordinary and remarkable. And to be a vandal, and because I think it needs British leadership. I think that's the tragedy. It's a tragedy for Britain. I mean, it's just, you know, let's shoot this foot and let's shoot that foot in terms of the economy. I mean, it's just nuts. And it doesn't address the issues that made a lot of people vote leave, which is in terms of immigration and people they don't want to have there. But you know, that's not an EU issue. I mean, Britain has a lot of control over who goes there and who doesn't go there. And they had a lot of exemptions from other requirements, the Schengen Agreement, the Eurozone. I mean, they have their own special deal there. But it's, you know, it's just so destructive. And for somebody, for the basest political goals, to play fast or loose, to be a vandal with international institutions that serve people's interests and are guarantors of peace and prosperity, you know, I mean, I was too kind there.
It's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.